So this is 5 minutes to 8 GMT on Monday, the 10th of August 2020. This is part 2 of the diagnosis of Fleet Street. In other words, the newspapers, English-centric, little English, pro-racist, anti-Scots, denying the Wales, denying the Cornish, and in contemptuous abuse of the Irish. The papers published almost entirely from London. Now this is the Daily Mail of today, page 16, the editorial comment. It is again going on about France, and it is continuing the anti-migrant, quote, crusade that Priti Patel, the Gujarati background, African originated daughter that is now the Home Secretary in Britain, carrying out the same hostile environment and pro-racist hostility against the victims of war, starvation, and famine that are seeking refuge in Western countries. The victims have been made victims by the British state and British big business operating wars agenda in those countries in Africa and Asia. So it says that the French must do more to end migrant crisis. This is absolutely typical racist, ignorant piece. And it has got even the former First Sea Lord, Admiral Lord West. He's another racist who was a member of the House of Peers and was obviously a Navy man and had been a minister in the Blair Brown years. So the Daily Mail is, on the one hand, kind of castigating Don Butler for raising concern about the police stop and search, having said in part 1 what we have said about Don Butler's limitations. Essentially, the borderline, the bottom line of our concern is still valid, that it is against racist abuse of police powers that she's talking about. And that has to be commended and supported. But West, the Navy ex-man, Admiral West, whatever, is being pitted against any residual anti-racist element in the Labour Party fronted by Keir Starmer. By his joining as a name the racist agenda fronted by Priti Patel and propagated by the likes of the Daily Mail today. And they have found a kind of symbol in Beirut of Western kind of victim of the blast. We shall come to that peripheral racist coverage or cover up on the true background to the Beirut blast little later. Now, the propaganda for the idea of the police being special is part of the Daily Mail's makeup. And it says today, it's continuing, page 32. The widow of P.C. Gareth Phillips, no, widow of P.C. Andrew Harper. P.C. Gareth Phillips was injured, but Andrew Harper was the one that died in the attack. So they are asking for harsher punishment for killers of the police. Now that actually is not something that the Daily Mail or anybody should be doing exclusively about the police victims of crime, because in that way they make whatever pretense there is of the law being equal ridiculous and incredible and weaken that claim. And again, in that tendency and propensity by the Daily Mail to carry on with that agenda without any real intervention by the Labour Party about moral integrity, ethical integrity, social integrity, or constitutional or due process or other integrity or compliance with the principles of equality enshrined in the Magna Carta, etc. The Labour Party comes completely with blanks, as it has come on this one, and as it has come indeed in the case of the migrants crusade that Priti Patel is fronting, the crusade against the migrants. Because it's Admiral West who is no longer part of the front bench. He is still being exploited as labor. That is the thing. That in order to add substance to the idea that it is an all-party, common sense approach to hate migrants, they have recruited the support or the name or they have bought the name of Admiral West. The Labour Party is nowhere there, nowhere visible in that. And apart from Don Butler's personally kind of engaged criticism of the Metropolitan Police about stop and search, no other black person who is now a member of the Labour Party parliamentary group or parliamentary numbers is making the news or is making an impact in the news covered by the Des, Fleet Street or the London-centric newspapers. And that is the undoing of the Labour Party, and that is the undoing of Keir Starmer. Even if those who support a right-wing flank and the right-wing kind of alliance in government in power in this country, and if they ease Starmer into that position, replacing the Boris-fronted or other person-fronted Tory cabal, the fact that it will be Starmer fronting the government will make no difference in terms of changing the lack of democracy, changing the kind of persistence of racism in this country in the government. So what that means is that much more than the facade, the front is required, much more than the presence of a token member of parliament, a token opposition, or a token Labour Party flag carrier like Keir Starmer. And that brings the actual onus back to the people in the community, in society. And looking at the people on the ground and relating the population to the behavior of the Labour Party card-carrying members or to the behavior of the card-carrying members of the Green Party or the Lib Dems, there is no evidence that these card-carrying members are even aware of most of the defects inherent in the media, in the parliament, in the agenda being set by the forces controlling the scripting of the agenda of the government. Most party members in the Labour Party and in areas like Tower Hamlets in Newham and in Hackney, most Labour Party members are absolutely unaware of these facts. If they are aware by accident. And even if they are aware, they are not aware of the connections. They have no chain of connection, cause and effect, and there is no awareness of the policy, responsibility, and the campaigning duties on their part. So what does it mean? It means that the only people who are supposedly campaigning in communities about big issues about racism, etc., are the factory created placard carriers of the Socialist Workers' Party. They are the most visible ones in the images that the main media captures and peddles as being the opposition. But the factory produced placard carrying the Socialist Workers' Party themselves are a deterrent to the ordinary people in the various communities organizing on key issues on moral, ethical, democratic, independent, sustainable bases and grounds. So the Socialist Workers' Party is not only not socialist, but it is actually anti-social and anti the communities. And that is what the mainstream media know, and they like that, because that is the service to the continuation of the injustice and the racism and so on in society. So the Socialist Workers' Party are given a mention or a visual inclusion by the BBC, Sky News, and ITV, and Channel 4, and others for a reason. It's not accidental that they just happen to be before the cameras. They are included as part of the editorial decision and consideration. And that same decision that operates in the running orders, in the choice of the running orders, and the pegging of various issues on the BBC television and the radio programs like the LBC is replicated in effect in Fleet Street. So what we have in today's I newspaper is two items on the front page which both undermine the kind of positive black image. So there is a man called Brandon Tyler, who is described here as a 2020 Booker Prize nominee. And to his opposite, after the item about the animal on the seaside, is a piece about Naga Manchetti. Naga Manchetti failed to clear commercial work with her managers at the BBC. And this guy, who has been nominated for the 2020 Booker Prize, is saying in that headline that both of his parents are illiterate. So writing a book for him feels like a miracle. Now, although this guy, obviously looking like a guy from the African background, Brandon Tyler, is in fact a courier of the philosophy and the theory and the syndrome of Thomas Babington Macaulay, because he's writing a book in English feels like a miracle, shows that before him, his family were both illiterate. So writing a book is a miracle, and it's only possible because he has been English schooled and taught in English, etc. But before that, there was nothing. And Macaulay said that the Hindi language and the Urdu language and the Sanskrit language, they were absolute rubbish. And the first time that any linguistic ability and skill and resource could be created on the vast subcontinent would be if English was foisted on the subcontinent's people. How crass and stupid and idiotic and ignorant can a human being get? And since the 1830s, when Macaulay produced that line of rubbish, the so-called opposition to the Macaulay and the conservative and the reactionary and the right-wing ideologues, imperialists, they have not taken it up. I have been going on about it for decades, and I have not noticed even a single mention of Macaulay by any of these people. The only people who mentioned Thomas Babington Macaulay are two licensed law traders who wrote a book about race and law in the published in the 1970s, but they actually did the work in the late 1960s. And one of them has since become embroiled in allegations of sexual abuse and abuse of his position in the House of Lords, and offering an Asian woman a peerage if she slept with him. So it is completely disappointing to find that Anthony Lester, who was one of the two authors of that book that actually referred to Macaulay's racism, has ended his, quote, political career with such an episode. But I give him credit for the scholarship that he actually dedicated along with his co-writer. And that is the only occasion when the British, English, white people have actually correctly or at all referred to the bad work, the bad person that Thomas Babington Macaulay was. If there were a statue of Macaulay's, then I think it should be the target of demand for demolition. I don't know, I have not checked the whole list of the statues, but if there were, then he should be gone as an example. So coming back to today's newspaper and their depiction of this Brandon Tyler admitting his parents are both illiterate, and even worse, writing a book for him feels like a miracle. Now there have been literally hundreds of millions of writers in Asia and Africa. And yet reading this would appear that there have not been, that the overwhelming majority of people in Africa and Asia are not literate, and writing a book for all of them or most of them would feel like a miracle. So that's the agenda. That's the disease of racism that is festering even this kind of paper, which supposedly is less racist than the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Express, the newspaper. It says, front page is 65 pence is the top word, and then the next word, the next line is, journalism you can trust, Britain's fastest growing readership. Now, journalism, what kind of journalism and what is the trust? That it tells racist rubbish like that, and readership. Who are the readers? Are these the readers full of the DNA propensities, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities to pounce on any excuse and use it to foment hatred and violence and hostility and denial and deprivation of rights to the next Black Asian person they find and the spot or they hear about. So the I newspaper, which used to be owned by what the private eye calls the Two Beards, until he sold it, the I newspaper has been supposedly circulation-wise a successful paper in the context of decreasing circulation for most of the papers in Fleet Street because of its kind of, quote, unconventional, non-conventional line. But today's presentation shows that it is as racist, even more perniciously racist than the Daily Mail's brazen, the Sun's brazen and dirty, Daily Express's filthy, brazen racism. Because this item about Nagaman Chetty failing to clear commercial work with our managers is absolutely worth mentioning and reporting. But this is not the most important news that should be featured on the front page. There should be an in-depth feature there on racism as operated via the abuse by the state of the police, abuse and misuse of the police. There should be one there, and one should be about the Labour Party's failure. Keir Starmer's failure to address the role of the police as a whole in society. And so therefore, the papers are not only far, far behind their duties, but also fomenting racism and hatred that they otherwise claim they are against. And on page 5 of this today's paper, there is a repetition of the same line about migrants. They don't say who the migrants are. They really don't say in the headlines or in the main lead pieces of presentation as to why, what causes these people to risk everything, risk their lives, to want to come to any of the Western countries. It says about 4,000 migrants have reached the UK in 2020 by making the dangerous crossing over the English Channel, according to the latest figures. But it does not say what caused these people to leave their homes, what other hardships and difficulties and denials and deprivations, what hardship in terms of hunger they have been suffering on the way. And that is where Fleet Street is actually festering in creating and perpetuating racist lies and not informing the people about the real reason why these migrants in numbers want to come to this country. And that is where it should be taken back to, and the paper should be scrapped, and the paper should be condemned, and paper should be subjected to any economic sanctions if there is any, because the billionaire like Two Beards, Lebedev, may not lose much if his outlets are not given advertisement. This is not his anymore. This is the paper that is owned by another outlet, but they will suffer economically if there is a boycott of their advertisement. But then that raises the question: how many advertisers are actually naturally opposed to racism? How many Asians and Africans really own sufficiently big commercial operations that can advertise, can buy advertising revenue, that can actually make any impact against the behavior like the I newspaper that actually imitates its so-called not models, rivals. And this is why, again, I go back to the role of the members of parliament. What are they doing? They are absent. It seems to me on the evidence that the reason why, one of the main reasons why the MPs are silent about the racism of the media is because they don't want to lose any spot, positive spot in the media. It is therefore a vicious circle and a vicious cycle of racists colluding and capitulating. And therefore, it again takes the case back to society, the community, the people affected. And if you look at the output, the contents contained in the little outlets that are operated in the name of the various parts of the population, called the Asian population, the African population, the Caribbean population, or the Bangladeshis or Indians or Pakistanis, these operators of little media outlets are even more unacceptably compliant and complicit with the races than can be described. So the individual people have to do what they can within the law, do to defend themselves, protect their rights, and stay out of the attention of racists, either operating through the police or racists operating in other platforms and agencies of the country. So this is a diagnosis of despair, some may say, but it is not a diagnosis of despair. It is a diagnosis of the evidence to avoid, to fight, to fend off and stop despair. Now, this is the lying Beaverbrook newspaper. Beaverbrook has gone a long time ago, but his style of lying has remained. The Daily Express is not as vicious in the totality of its contents as the Daily Mail or the Daily Sun, but the Daily Mail is the most vicious, corrupt, loudly pronouncing headline writer that exists in Fleet Street. And it is true not only of the print version, but also of the internet version of the Daily Express, where in the last, especially the last 3 years, they have been promoting the image of George Galloway as if he has campaigned with the racists all his political career. All the time he has been fighting against the people of Scotland. All the time he has been fighting against the Muslim community and serving the agenda of the racists fronted by Nigel Farage and epitomized by Boris Johnson. The Daily Express has always, in the internet version of its coverage of the role being played by George Galloway, exaggerated his importance in every way and used these words to qualify the power of his spewing. George Galloway blasts Nicola Sturgeon. George Galloway reduces to tears the entirety of the European Union Parliament or whatever. That kind of ridiculous, absolutely unsubstantiated and unsubstantiable claims for George Galloway's power is evidence of the utter falsehood and fabrication of the Daily Express and its agenda. George Galloway, since he staged a detour in Bradford West at the expense of the Muslim community in the electorate there in 2012, following his enforced departure from the East End of London Tower Hamlets at the 2010 election. George Galloway has entered into various arenas to stage a comeback detour, and he has been comprehensively, convincingly told that he is not wanted by those electors or the electorates. He has come either at the very bottom of the list of candidates or near the very bottom. And yet, the Daily Express calls him ex-Labour MP, ex-Respect leader, or ex this and that. But most of the times, George Galloway's so-called headlines are based on his appearances on or his spewing issued via the very powerful, technically powerful, mechanically powerful Russian television network. And this is not only an insult to ordinary common sense, but it is absolutely a disgrace to the idea that the same person, George Galloway, was ever an opponent of racism, because he is now not only openly but shamelessly colluding with the most racist incumbents in political office or abusers of media propaganda platforms like Nigel Farage in this country. And Galloway has been photographed with Steve Bannon. I mean, that does not even need any further explanation. And this was the guy who appeared in November 2014 at a platform in Mile End, London E1, claiming to be supporting the community he said was represented by Lutfur Rahman, still in post as the mayor of Tower Hamlets. So we have in this country, in Britain today, in the public arena, a preponderance of people and elements and media that are absolutely unrepresentative of basic realities on the ground, any concern for the communities they claim to be representing, and there is no evidence that the ones making the executive decisions or holding the executive posts are being held to account by the ones that are paid publicly to hold them to account. So the emptiness and the vacuum that exists is something that must be addressed by daily pointing out the evidence that it does exist. That is the first point. And then once the evidence is there, whoever has any conscience can and must take action. And this is the role that we are playing as one of the contributions that we are making to propelling people to action to defend the rights, basic rights, universal rights, treaty rights, and human rights, and the rights of the victims of racism now and before. And this is the Star newspaper, which is from the same stable as the Daily Mirror, but it used to be the stable owned by Richard pornographic billionaire Dirty Desmond until he relinquished control of the group, and this became consumed and taken over by the same group as the Daily Mirror. And it is not bothered about the pandemic. It is back to pornography. And this tells all there is to tell about the role of the Fleet Street papers in whether they care about the community, the safety of people, or not. They don't. And there are other issues, items, including the court case or cases about the NHS, where they're saying that the money belonging to the NHS, 1.4 billion, has been wasted by lawyers taking most of the money. And this is based on the conservative pressure group called Taxpayers Alliance. The Taxpayers Alliance is not objective, but often it brings out some of the abuses of public money, including the abuses by mostly Labour-run or Labour-controlled councils, local councils. The Taxpayers Alliance has not focused on Tower Hamlets as much as it has on other councils, but it has sometimes included Tower Hamlets as one of the wasters of public money, especially when it included Tower Hamlets on the list of councils paying millions of pounds to their overpaid directors and others. But the Taxpayers Alliance is not a democratically accountability demanding campaigning organization. It's a creepy organization that abuses the abusing behavior of Labour controlled or pro-society outfits and outlets and organizations. Now here is a piece by Kevin McGuire, who is absolutely as opportunistic as Keir Starmer and other people that he is supposedly criticizing in today's column. And the Daily Mirror's editorial about the coronavirus is as timid as it has always been. And the same line about the police, the killers of the police, that the other right-wing papers are following. The killers of the police should be given harsher sentences. Now there are so many racists that are taken to court and are, most of them, allowed to walk free. Racist attackers, men and women, in the last 20 years, hardly anyone has been convicted. That is not accidental, and that is not due to lack of evidence. That is despite overwhelming evidence. Again, that is an area which is being left unattended, unaddressed by the MPs and by the Labour Party. And when it comes to the community organizations that are funded by local councils, such as happened in Tower Hamlets when Luther Rahman gave grants to dozens of organizations, including a number that didn't actually apply for money. So this corruption of councils and corruption through councils is making that cause of getting racists stopped and held to account, it is undermining that cause. And there is no outlet, the so-called ethnic community-linked outlet or media that is even aware of what is going on, or at least showing the objective, factual, evidential awareness of this big, big deficit and defect. And the Sun is saying today that deprived areas get cash for planning. This is a spin for Robert Jendrik, and his attack on planning, his attack on the role of the local councils to have a say on degenerators building and exploiting and raising big tall buildings, depriving people who need housing of housing. He's saying that the deprived areas get the money under planning, which is absolute lie. Now, this is the two-page spread by the Murdoch Sun in celebration of Boris Johnson's unfitness to be in number 10 Downing Street. And it is promoting Boris Johnson as girlfriend in Scotland. And it is absolutely disgraceful. And it is not worth line by line diagnosis, because it will be making anyone viewing this or anyone looking at this objectively, this spectacle, even more uneasy than they must be by the cursory look at it. And there is a column by Douglas Murray, who is another right-wing extremist. He's writing the column because Trevor Kavanagh is away. Now, where is he away? This is the Sun, and they've got a smaller piece about Dawn Butler. The headline saying that she was stopped by the police because she is black. That is absolutely without any doubt the case, but there is more detail about that stop than has been apparent in what she has said herself and what the media has been prepared to say on her behalf. Now, the Times is the only paper that is still talking in any significant way about the virus. The others are treating the virus as if it's gone. But the fact is that the virus is very much present and very much threatening society and safety of millions. And it is saying that the virus test should be made compulsory for teachers and pupils. It's saying routine, but that's what it means. And on page 5, it's talking about the BBC receiving 18,000 complaints about one of its presenters using the N word. The N word is about the African people, and so the BBC has apologized. And this is the piece that we shall be coming back to in a minute. Let's see what this is about. Yes, earlier I mentioned about Macaulay, about Anthony Lester. I did that without reading or before reading this piece that is on page 6 of today's Times about Anthony Lester, who has, according to this piece, died. And he died at age 84. Lord Lester of Herne Hill, the lawyer who played a crucial role in enacting race and sex discrimination laws in the UK, as well as pressing for human rights legislation, has died aged 84. Now, Lester, as I said correctly, was one of the scholars who actually acknowledged the racist role and utterances of T.B. Macaulay. And the Times correctly, accurately, factually, that is, mentions that um, the role he played for human rights legislation. They don't talk about Macaulay, of course they won't, but that is what it is. He did that comprehensively. Anthony Lester was a comprehensive opponent of racist, so much of racist legislation and so much of anti-human rights part of the British Constitution, etc., etc. So he will be correctly remembered and recognized for that role, and I recognize that. And I also do the footnote that he, for whatever reason, got embroiled in the allegations made against him by this woman called Jasvinder Sangera, who the Times says is aged 53. So the Panic, who is a barrister, quote QC, who served in the same Blackstone chambers as Lord Leicester, said that his determination and persistence changed the face of public law advocacy in this country, with its focus on human rights and international standards. Now, that quote by Panic, who, as I have said in previous editions of this broadcast, has been reportedly charging certain clients as much as £20,000 for one day's retainer. Now, Panic also featured in both the Supreme Court cases involving Gina Miller, who was the front person named as the opponent of the Brexit unconstitutionality and abuse, etc. But Panic also spoiled his own reputation by standing up for Anthony Lester over the allegations made by Jasvinder Sangera against him, against Lester. Panic could have refrained from intervening in the House of Lords, trying to clear or excuse Anthony Lester over his alleged sexual misconduct. But he didn't. He chose to speak up for him. And I think that undermined and diminished both Panic and Lester in that context. But that is the literally updater piece about Lester in the same broadcast, almost, that I said about him positive things about his role in human rights legislation, etc., and anti-racist legislation especially, without reading or before reading the item about his passing in the same edition. So that is very rare update of the facts in the course of the same broadcast. Now here is a piece in the Times, page 14, blaming paperwork. Paperwork is stopping social workers helping children. Now there is something wrong in the administration or in the organization of the administrations by the people who employ these social workers. If that is the case, then they should reorganize the work and prioritize the urgent need for the children to be given the service and support that they deserve. Now, here is a trebly ironic piece on page 24 of the Times, where there is an absolutely ironic piece in the subheading to the piece given to the official nephew Tom, Trevor Terrible Phillips, on page 24 of the Times, because Trevor Phillips has been a paid, officially engaged opponent of anti-Muslim hatred in this country. And here he is. His headline says that the protesters in Beirut which is a Muslim country mainly, and migrants in the channel, most of them are Muslim, if not all of them, are united in their desire for real freedom. How is it that this mental slave, is acknowledging that there is any relevance of freedom and democracy to the plight of these people? Because he has been the active, very black-skinned servant of the racist propagandists in this country, spewing hatred, incitement, intolerance against black people generally and especially against Muslims. And here he is. So, as he did in the case of the first outbreak of the widespread outbreak of pandemic in this country, when he said that Muslim areas were less vulnerable to the spread of the virus because Muslims have got certain religious practices and they don't eat or do certain other things that actually expose people to the infection. That was wrong because that was based on a kind of hearsay, not actual real evidence of real life behavior by people. And so that was actually him riding on the headline, grabbed the headline, and by appearing to be showing some respect for the traditions of the Muslims, whom he had demonized for the previous 20 years in order to make himself acceptable to his racist masters and mistresses. His racist mistresses, including, of course, Hattie Harman and Polly Toynbee of The Guardian, who publicly referred to him as Trevor, as if he is either their house slave or their first mate. And then he is now in the Times today over shamelessly, unashamedly riding on the news headlines about Beirut, the protests in Beirut after the explosion, and the news featured case of the migrants in the channel. He has no shame and he has no evidence-based credibility or claim to credibility. Trevor Terrible Phillips was supporting all the racists of the age because he was installed as a young person in his late teens or early 20s as the young nephew Tom by the racists in Britain. And they have sheltered him and they have guided him. They have given him jobs in television and other places, in newspapers, media, over the last more than 40 years in order to use him as the mental slave, looking black and doing the job of Macaulay's descendants and followers. And he's attacking people that Macaulay targeted, mainly people from the subcontinent of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, mostly Muslims and others. So, in the consideration of the editorial commissioning by the so-called once famous, notorious newspaper, the newspaper of records, the Times doesn't seem to make any difference between Terrible Phillips's outlandish role as a paid mental slave against Muslims and his pretension to understand some Muslims and some Muslim customs when it suits him. They should not take the readers generally for fools, and they should not take Muslims for fools or observers for fools, and they should not leave historians to condemn them comprehensively for their stupidity. So the Times editors and editorial commissioners are behaving when it comes to serious issues, including racism and the virus and the cause of democracy. They're very, very loose, and they're irresponsible, they're ignorant, they're not reading up on the issues that they actually supposedly commission the likes of Trevor Phillips on. And they don't appear to do the same either about the role of the local councils, where the excuse is that paperwork is stopping most social workers from helping children. So they're saying that the top civil servant who has been ousted by Dominic Cummings, Mark Sedwell, has defended the £250,000 payoff that he was given, because he said that that is the standard amount that is given to the likes of him who are forced out of their job. Now, there is a rare piece here on page 19, which is rare in the context of the role of the police that we have discussed earlier when we diagnosed the role of the papers over Don Butler's complaint against the Metropolitan Police. Here is a girl who died fighting X, alerted Met Police 3 times in the same police force, the London Metropolitan Police. And the Times' crime editor is called Fiona Hamilton, whose piece is a teenager killed in a fight with her former boyfriend had repeatedly complained to the police about his violent behavior in the weeks before she died. A pre-inquest review heard. Katrina Makunova, 17, had told Scotland Yard that Oluwesi Dada, a drug dealer, was capable of murder before he pushed her during a fight and she fell on an 8-inch knife in her handbag. So, the Miss Makunova, a trainee beautician, reported Dada, 21, to police 3 times in 6 weeks before her death in July 2018. Dada had been jailed for county lines drug dealing and had been convicted of assaulting his mother. He was sentenced to 2 years in jail in January last year after pleading guilty to the manslaughter of Miss Makunova. Southwark Coroner's Court in London heard that before her death, he sent Miss Makunova a text that read, "I'm going to," swear word, and a threat to seriously harm her. "I'm going to do you. You must think I'm joking." Frederick Powell, a barrister for Miss Makunova's family, said that she had told police, "I feel like people like him are actually capable of murder, literally, because he is just not okay in the head." Mr. Powell said, had the investigation properly followed up with Katrina and build trust in that relationship, had electronic communications been obtained and viewed and risk assessments taken place, it would have been evident that there was a lethal risk. Andrew Harris, the senior coroner, decided to resume the inquest to consider whether the Metropolitan Police failed to protect Miss Makunova. He agreed there was plenty of evidence that there was a real risk to her life, but to expand the inquest beyond its usual remit and consider systematic police failure, the threat had to be immediate. Stephen Morley, a barrister for the Metropolitan Police, denied that was the case. He confirmed that 12 officers linked to the case had undergone internal misconduct procedures. 2 were subject to gross incompetence meetings. A domestic homicide review report is expected to provide critical evidence in further proceedings, the court heard. Another hearing is due this year. Now, this is very important because 2 things. One is that Miss Makunova, I think it is correct to say that Miss Makunova is of Eastern European background and identity, and her murderer or killer, Dada, is of African identity. Now that means that the coroner's hearing that has been resumed, as the Times piece says, may be linked to the fact that a significant additional importance being attached to her death because of her ethnic origin, and on the other side, the murderer or her killer. Whichever the case, the fact is that the police are capable of overlooking evidence and thus failing to take the action that could have saved this life and other lives in similar circumstances. If that is the case, then the line that the police are deterred by the possibility of being accused of racist bias if they prosecute a known Asian or Muslim for a crime. That is not true. That cannot be true. How can it be true? Because they say, in the case of Luthu Rahman, that despite the fact that all this evidence has been found at various stages, it is suggested that the Metropolitan Police or the prosecuting authorities did not prosecute Luthu Rahman because there may be a possible backlash in terms of the people supposedly supporters of Luthu Rahman saying that he was prosecuted because he was Muslim or Asian or whatever. The same allegation has been made over and over and over and over again in the reporting of the mainly Pakistani sex abuse or sex grooming gangs operating in Rochdale, in other parts of North England or Northern England, in Yorkshire. Because they say that to prosecute most of them, or to prosecute them at the time that they were known to be engaged in crimes concerned that could be prosecuted, would have brought backlash against the police, saying that they were prosecuting because these targets of prosecution or the alleged criminals were Muslim or Asian or whatever. The police attack on the 2 Asian doctors, both of them doctors, both of them working in full-time, fully licensed, qualified doctor capacities. Their plight has been reported in the last 3-4 days. And they're both Asian, and the father is called Abbasi, and the father and mother both qualified doctors, and Abbasi, the father, has been described as a consultant and he was physically restrained and arrested or removed by a group of uniformed police in a hospital in northern England when he and his wife were trying to get attention and care and support for their 6-year-old daughter who later died. She was caused to be killed by withdrawal of support because the other doctors in control of the decisions about whether they should let her live or die, they decided to let her die and deny her the care that she could have received. So the details have come out, and the details include the footage taken from the police body camera or cameras. Now, these people, both the mother dresses in an Asian way, so there is no way that she could be mistaken for not being an Asian, and the father has a beard and clearly of the Asian appearance. And the way they were treated shows that not only are the police not bothered about any repercussion, but they are quite prepared to behave in the same way that the police who killed or strangulated or strangled the American black man, whose strangulation gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement taking on the momentum it has taken. So the police in Britain, in England, in northern England, in this context, are not only not bothered about, they're not only not bothered about any reaction from the community, perceived community about their racial bias, they are quite openly willing to do things that can, on the evidence so far published, amount to undoubted brutality, cruelty, and lack of merciless, and the evidence of merciless determination to kill or help the killers of that child. So this is the diagnosis of not only today's newspapers, also known as Fleet Street, but also of the likes of those MPs and former MPs who have aided and abetted the lying, racist, deadly, irresponsible line that the Asians or the Muslims or the black people cannot be taken action against, the criminally liable Asians, because of any possible backlash against the police. That is not the case. That never has been the case. And again, the fact that this has actually taken any root in the propaganda narrative shows the failure of Jeremy Corbyn as leader 5 years and the failure of the Labour Party leadership before. And the Labour Party, contrary to the myth that they actually circulate to suit their careerist, opportunistic aims and agendas in local areas, have never been significantly against racism in any shape, way, or form. The only time they have agreed to mouth any substantial level of opposition to racism is when it has become clear to them that doing so would serve them electorally. As for example, Roy Hattersley became embroiled in a kind of controversy raised by the allegation from one of the Lambeth councillors or Lambeth activists in the 1980s. After Hattersley used the phrase "my Asians." That was at the height of the Labour Party corruptly constituting the Labour Party black sections, which then enabled Diane Abbott, Barney Grant, Paul Bertrand, and sleaze Keith Vaz to be the first 4 black MPs through that platform. Now, all of them have forgotten about black section and the promises that they made against anti-black racism in the Labour Party. None of them has made any significant contribution, including Barney Grant. Barney Grant is dead now, but his record is alive and we can check. Barney Grant did not make any systematic, constitutional, democratic, persistent, community-based effort to hold the Labour Party racists to account. And there is the problem. And it is the problem that exists in Haringey, existed in Haringey, as it exists in Lambeth, as it exists in Sadak, in Hackney, in Waltham Forest, in Newham, and of course in Tower Hamlets and in Islington, in Camden, in Westminster. So the media knows all the facts. If it doesn't know all the facts because it doesn't employ black people in positions of independent authority in the editorial sections, then it receives more than necessary amount of information about the persistent racism going on in every part of society, every day of the year. And reading the media would not give that impression. Reading the media, the Fleet Street, would suggest that the biggest race-related threat facing Britain was this group of desperate migrants coming to escape poverty and hunger and famine in their own countries, where Britain, as a powerful state and big business, continue to imperialistically, corruptly, capitalistically, oppressively interfere. And there is no sign at either the parliament level or the government level or in the media of the obligations to the internationally signed and adhered to and valid and active treaties. The only mention today to the treaties has been, of course, in the obituary report about Anthony Lester. But that is a dead reference, literally, on every level. So we are ending this edition at 9:08 GMT on Monday, the 10th of August, 2020. We shall be continuing in the next editions.